Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We've got an intimate group tonight, so we'll see. Maybe it'll be a little bit more informal. We'll see how it goes. I actually had a whole talk planned. That's planned is a little extreme, but I had an idea. And then I realized that last Saturday was what we call Buddha's Enlightenment Day. And I thought I'd take a little time and unpack that. I'm not a scholar, and I'm not very much of a Buddhist historian. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Buddha. It's historically somewhat accurate, but it's my take on things. So this might be a little bit iconoclastic in how I twist the story a little bit. And as I was thinking about this, I would have to say that this story is the way I'm going to tell the story is a little bit shaded by my younger self, kind of the younger self that was perhaps a little bit more anti-establishment and really seeing the flaws of our world. Not that I don't see them now, but I think I have a little bit of a different attitude towards things. But I remember soon after I heard the story of the Buddha was a prince. He was born in what we now call Nepal. It was part of India, I suppose, at the time, but there was no such thing as India. There were small little kingdoms scattered around, and his father was the king. And when he was born, before he was born, there was a prophecy that either his son or his child, I guess he assumed it was a son, it doesn't make sense as I say it now, was either going to be a great king or political leader or a great religious figure. His father had no interest in his son being a religious figure. So he felt that he needed to control his son's environment so he wouldn't become a religious leader. So essentially, he was the young Shakyamuni was a bit of a prisoner inside the temple, inside the palace walls. Now, imagine it was a big palace. He had plenty of room to spread out, and he was the pampered son of the king who could have anything his heart desired. And he got married. He actually had a son himself, and he was living this life of splendor and majesty. Something started to happen inside of him. He wasn't sure what it was, but there was something wrong. And in the story, there's something about he received the heavenly messengers, and the heavenly messengers were poverty, old age, sickness, and death. And this was kept from him his whole life. He was so pampered. His father was so worried that he would become a religious figure that he kept suffering away. Think about that. Suffering is the opening to a spiritual life. Suffering is the opening to questioning and to wonder. And in my younger self's mind, the Buddha was lied to. He grew up in a false world. His father tried to pamper him and control what he understood about the world in order to get a particular result. And at the age of, late 20s, I guess, he realized that it was all a lie. First he had his attendant help him get out of the palace. He saw poverty. He saw a corpse. He saw people sick. And he saw death. Poverty, old age, sickness, and death. They're all around us. I've been talking with somebody who is a doctor, and he's in palliative care. He's actually just starting up in this. And he says the same thing that everybody always says to me. Actually, 2 people said this to me today. Our culture doesn't deal well with death. People don't plan. They act as if they're not going to die. Now, the reality is death is all around us. It's happening every day, all the time, and we all know it. But we have this mechanism to disconnect from it, to not really take it on. One of my dearest, closest friends, I was talking to him this afternoon, and his mother's old. She's starting to fall. She's starting to have these problems. And she's totally unprepared for what's happening to her. To take in these heavenly messengers, poverty, old age, sickness, and death. Some of us are dealing with poverty right now. It's not some fantasy, some thing that happens to other people. None of these heavenly messengers are just things that happen to other people. Each one of us struggles with our economic situation. And if we're not, you hear stories all the time of the one false move and everything falls away. There is a basic insecurity in our existence. We all deal with sickness. We all deal with old age. If we're not there yet, it's coming. I've told this story about 3 or 4 months ago. I was visiting my mother in Florida, and I was sitting at this big table. There were about 14 people around the table, and they were all her friends, and they were all older. One person, well, I think, if I'm remembering right, at the time there were about 3 people who had cancer. One was already terminal. Probably another one has already died just in these last 4 months. And sitting with them, I realized I'm not any different. I may be a few years behind them, maybe a generation behind them, but there's no guarantee that I'm not going to go before them. We think it's never going to happen. So the Buddha was lied to about all this, and he had this privileged life, but it had no reality to it. And once he started to get the inkling of reality, he couldn't stay at the temple. And he did things that in our present day and age, people wonder, how could he do this? He left the palace, he left his wife, he left his young son, and he took off into the woods, into the forest. And in India at that time, that was what you did. If you got a spiritual inkling, you left home, you went into the forest, and there were various yogic practices that people practiced. And the Buddha apparently, for about a time of around 6 years, he tried this, he tried that, he tried all these things, nothing was working for him. One of the things he tried was in that time period, there was this idea that spiritual essence and human life essence, or the physical body and the spiritual body, were in opposition to each other. If you wanted to develop your spiritual body, you actually starved your physical body. And there are some statues and pictures of the Buddha where he's completely emaciated, skin and bones, and you can see each one of his ribs. And that was at the time that they were trying to get just before you starve to death, with the idea that somehow you'd get this great liberation. Nothing worked for him. He saw through it. He was a good practitioner. He would get praise, but nothing was getting him the freedom from the suffering that he was looking for. So the story goes that I think they called her a milkmaid, happened to come by, and he took some milk from her. He started to replenish his body. And when his compatriots saw that, they left him. as if he was turning his back on the way, and he decided to just sit down. And from our Zen perspective, we would say he raised this don't know mind, and he sat down and he watched, and he waited, and he watched, and he waited. Then the story goes that all the demons and all of his desires appeared before him, and he had to go through perhaps what we might call these days the dark night of the soul. He went through all of this pain and suffering and practice, and then they say on the 8th day of the 12th month, he looked up and he saw the morning star. And when he saw the morning star, everything opened up. And in that moment, he understood his true nature. He understood the way. And the way the story goes is he understood the four noble truths and the Eightfold Path. Four noble truths are: there is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. There is the possibility of ending suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, which is 8, I'll never say them all because I can't remember things like that, but it's things like right attitude, right meditation, right ethics, right conduct, right livelihood, and I probably left out a few. And if you follow that Eightfold Path, you also can find but you can attain your true nature and have this awakening. We like to say that what the Buddha understood on his awakening was that he and this universe were one thing, never separate. And if he and this universe are one thing, then you and you and you and me and you, all of us, are that exact same thing. This universe is one thing, one flash of lightning. It arises out of the mystery, returns to the mystery. This moment is the essential expression of true nature. We suffer because we can't handle it. We spin stories to protect ourselves from the insecurity and the fear and the anxiety that impermanence and non-self arises within us. So our practice is to wake up. Very brief story, very brief recitation of the story. Fundamentally, we also have the same problem that the Buddha had. As we're growing up, we're lied to. We're told a story about what the world is, which isn't true. We're socialized to believe that story. We're conditioned in a way that our closest family and friends and community condition us into a society, and we're expected to follow the path that society has set for us. In the olden days, and they're really not so old, for a man, if your father did it, that's what you're going to do. And for a woman, your mother took care of the family, and that's what you're going to do. And that's it. Generation after generation, you just followed what you were supposed to do. But the Buddha said there's a way out of that. There's a way towards freedom. So we practice to find this liberation and freedom. So, I'm going to read to you a poem. I pull this poem out every Buddha's Enlightenment Day. And if you were here last Saturday and you had an interview with me, I'm not sure anybody in this room was, you would have been given this as a koan for the week. And like I say, I pull it out every year. Wait until next year, I'll pull it out again. So this is called A Poem for Buddha's Enlightenment Day by Zen Master Bon Soeng. I pointed this out before, but we've got the pictures of 3 different Zen masters on the back wall. Bon Soeng is, as I'm looking directly at it, he's on the right side. Mangang lived in the probably late 1800s. He died, I think, in 1946. And he was a Zen master through a very tumultuous time in Korea. The Japanese were occupying the country. And the Japanese Buddhists were trying to change Korean Buddhists to follow their model. Back in the late 1860s, I think it was 1868, in order to curtail the power of the Buddhist monks, the emperor decided that all the monks should marry. Rather than being celibate monks, which was the path since days of old, the emperor decided that it was time for everyone to get married. And that's what happened in Japan. And even to this day, to be a monk in Japan does not mean you're necessarily celibate. So they went to Korea and they tried to change the Korean monastic system to fit that model. Mangang was one of the group of monks who resisted them. Story goes, he was threatened at the end of a gun with death if he didn't follow through. He didn't. He lived to tell about it later. And our tradition grows out of that resistance. Zen Master Sungsan's teacher was Kobang. Kobang was a given transmission by Mangang. Zen Master Sungsan is over there, gave transmission to me. So, Poem for Buddha's Enlightenment Day by Zen Master Mangang. The Buddha saw a star, got enlightenment. Mangang saw a star, lost enlightenment. December 8th, ha! Explodes, got and lost. In the snow, plum flowers, one by one, are red. This poem essentially points to something very important. First line, if you remember what I said, on the 8th day of the 12th month. Now remember, this was a lunar calendar. So imagine not December 8th like we celebrate it, but probably February 8th, or sometimes, or not even February 8th. It's the 8th day of the last lunar month. So, Buddha saw a star, we say he got enlightenment. Enlightenment is not what we think. That whole story I told you about enlightenment, that's not enlightenment. That's a story about enlightenment. There's a Van Morrison song called Enlightenment, and the chorus goes, enlightenment, don't know what it is. And if you listen to the song, he's really saying, I don't know what it is, I'm still suffering. But if you take those words another way, enlightenment, don't know what it is. Don't know is your true self. Not knowing is the doorway to enlightenment. And maybe what I'm really saying, it is enlightenment. Before thinking mind. Before we're lost, we're in the story of I got something. It's not what you think. It's the most important thing to take away from this talk tonight. Enlightenment is not the story you make of it. So if you come to practice because you want enlightenment, be careful. Because what you're going to get is not what you think. What you think is a story that's been created maybe from what you've read, maybe your own desire. Your idea, my idea of enlightenment is a story that we fantasize about. So Mangang is hitting that. Buddha saw a star, got enlightenment. Mangang saw a star, lost enlightenment. Maybe not every night, but most nights, if it's not raining or foggy, you go outside, you see that star. I came to practice Tuesday morning, and I get in my car around 6 o'clock, and there's just a little bit of beautiful golden light on the horizon. And then up, about a third of the way up, there's Venus. Boom. It's available for all of us. It's not special. Every morning you can look at that star. And every morning you have access to what the Buddha had. So Mangang says, I saw a star, I lost enlightenment. Got lost. We all want to get it, we don't want to lose it. That's our fantasy. That's our gaining mind. That's the idea that if I get something, then I'll be better, then I'll be something. It's all around attachment to I, how others will see me, what I'll think about myself. I'll be this great and free person. In our temple rules it says, do not believe you're a great and free person. That is not true Buddhism. That will just lead you astray. Right now, what is it? So Mangong says, December 8th, explodes, got, and lost. Maybe the most important point in this poem. That shout there's no meaning. That shout is almost like shocking you into waking up. Drop everything. Then, whatever you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, everything is truth. This world just appears before us, before we make something about it. In the case of this poem, got and lost. So the last line of the poem is the truth line. In the snow, plum flowers one by one are red. Now remember, Mangong lived in Korea, and very likely the morning of that Buddha's Enlightenment Day, the plum flowers were blossoming and there was snow on the ground. We have we've lost one, but we have one more plum tree over here and one over there. Every February, they appear. And maybe since this is Berkeley and not Central Korea, we could say, in the rain, plum flowers, one by one, are red. The truth is just like this. Don't make got, don't make lost. Wake up. What's happening right now? That's what's most important. Not your idea of what you're supposed to be, but wake up to this moment. Be here and respond. What am I doing now? So the story went that the Buddha attained enlightenment, and he said, nobody's going to understand this. I'm just going to sit here. And I don't know, maybe one of those deities that floats around, they said, one more step, Buddha. Buddha means awake. So Mr. Awake, what are you going to do with this? In our school, we call this correct function. You perceive truth, but one more step, what do you do with it? We say, when you see someone's hungry, what? When you see someone's thirsty, what? When you walk past that person in need, what? When your friend or your lover needs something from you and you don't feel like it, what? This moment, wake up. This moment, perceive what's true, and using this correct function, act, manifest it, be it. It's not enough to have a good feeling. If you're just searching for a good feeling, if the release from suffering for you is bliss, you're going to be disappointed. Because once you open, the pain and suffering of the world is right here. How we respond to that is the measure of our experience. If you just get lost in a good experience for me, you're just perpetuating the problem. You may have a good feeling, but that good feeling will go. You may think you're safe, but one day you'll find out that you're not. How do we deal with impermanence? How do we deal with the reality of human life? That's what practice is about. And we practice to be ready. We sit in this room. This weekend we have a one-day meditation retreat. We'll sit in this room for about 7 or 8 hours, including lunch and a little bit of work. Wake up. We sit in this room to get in touch with something bigger than ourselves, before thinking mind. So we raise this question, what am I? It was something I read, I don't know who it was from. Sometimes if you come here in the morning or evening for regular practice, you get a little reading read afterwards, so you get little tidbits. And what I heard was, where there's great doubt, there's practice. Where there's curiosity, there's practice. Where there's inquiry, there's practice. Where there's now I'm adding something, this wasn't in the quote. Where there's complacency, there's no practice. Where there's certainty, there's suffering. Where there's greed, anger, and delusion, unquestioned, there's suffering. There's not only my suffering, but the suffering of the human condition. If you want a more peaceful and just world, make it, starting with your own being, your own responses, and your own actions. We say, how can I help this world? Each one of us will do that in our own way. There's no script. Each one of us has to find it for ourselves. We sit here to find our way.